Hey, great to have everyone joining. I know we're waiting on a few, so a bit of housekeeping. Sorry, I got an echo there. Bit of housekeeping while you join. I'm Bart Egnal. I'm the CEO of the Humphrey Group and the host of the Inspire podcast. I'm really excited to have everyone here for a live version of the Inspire podcast. Normally, we do these things, offline, edit them, record them, and release them to the public. And so this is really a neat opportunity to do something live. And part of that means having you here joining us for the conversation today. And so as you're listening to the podcast, you can write questions in. We have a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom bar, and you can write in your questions, and then we're going to leave some time, 15 minutes at the end, where Dane can tackle the questions that you have and really go deeper into what it takes to understand pressure and how to thrive in it. So I'll be the host today, and you'll see technologically as we go, the speaker will be spotlighted, and you'll be able to focus on Dane as he takes you deeper into the book. So I think, with a focus on being on time and thriving under pressure, we're going to get started. So let me officially welcome you to our live episode of the Inspire podcast. And joining me, very fortunate to have Dane Jensen, CEO of Third Factor. Dane, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Bart. It's awesome to be here live and in person.
Yeah, and welcome back to the podcast. I should do you justice and say this is your repeat offender or a repeat guest. You must have. I guess the rule is if you write a book, you get back on the pod. So nice to have you back.
That's why I wrote the book, was to get invited back to the podcast. That was the main goal.
So yeah. Your dream is realized today.
It's right.
Well, for those listening, hopefully you've all subscribed to the pod already. Just some quick context for who I am, who Dane is, and what brings us together. The Inspire podcast is a podcast I've been hosting for coming up on 3 years now. And we've approaching 100 episodes, and it's really been an opportunity to talk to people about what it takes to intentionally inspire. Dane was an early guest on that. And, I joke it's niche famous. I'm proud we've crossed 50,000 listens. Podcast is heard all over the world. And it's a wonderful opportunity for me to ask bright people about how to communicate in a way that leads. And so, Dane, it's great to have you back. And Dane is here representing the Third Factor, and we are proud to have this event put together by the Niagara Institute. So for those of you who don't know the Niagara Institute, it's a longstanding institution. I'm proud to be chairman there, whose focus is on bringing learning to the everyday leader. And Third Factor, Dane's business, is a partner of the Niagara Institute. So kind of a great fusion of Niagara, Third Factor, and the Humphrey Group. And we're really fortunate to have Dane. He's incredibly credentialed, and I'll try and just say a few great things about him. We could spend the whole pod, but he's the CEO of Third Factor. He's an instructor at Queen's Smith School of Business in Canada, where he's taught on resilience for many years. And he more recently has forged a great partnership with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's been an advisor to, I got to get the numbers right here, companies in 23 countries on 5 continents, though I'm sure with all the travel you're doing, Dane, that number is going up. And he's written in HBR, Harvard Business Review, and he's got this great book. You can see it lurking behind him there, The Power of
That's
Pressure.
Right.
I've read the book. I was fortunate enough to get an advanced copy. A lot of business books come my way. I read this one cover to cover. It's an easy read, but a compelling read. And I think that's the sign of great writing. And Dane coaches, he speaks all over the world, and he also has a grounding in work with athletes in Canada to help them reach high performance. So Dane, with that, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's awesome to be back. Genuinely, it's great.
Yeah, and I've done a lot of talking, so I'm going to start by putting you on the spot as these pods go, and let's delve into, the book is all about pressure and why it's not something to be feared, but rather a solution. So what led you to write the book?
Yeah, the book actually came together, Bart, reasonably organically, I would say. And it came about as a result of me kind of stumbling into what I kind of jokingly call this magic portal, which is kind of a hokey way of talking about it. But honestly, that's kind of what it felt like at the start. And this magic portal kind of took the shape of this one question that I started asking people. And it's the question, what's the most pressure you've ever been under? And this was a question that as I said, I kind of started asking organically. As you mentioned, I teach resilience. I've taught that for years. And this was a great question initially, just as kind of an icebreaker at lunch or on a break, just to kind of get people talking and connecting with each other. But honestly, almost from the first time I asked the question, I realized that it kind of had this unique power, because on the other side of that question, and it honestly doesn't matter who you ask it of, there is a remarkable story that is rooted in some pretty interesting wisdom. And so I started to get a lot more deliberate about asking, what's the most pressure you've ever been under? I sought interesting people out. I added a bunch of follow-up questions. What made it so high pressure? What did you do? Did that help? Did that hurt? What did other people do? Did that help? Did that hurt? And so, through collecting all of these stories, I was able to perform a bit of pattern recognition, and I started to go, hey, there's actually some interesting insights here. And I have a bit of a unique vantage point to ask that question from, because as you mentioned, at Third Factor, we're kind of like this sort of octopus, of cross-pollination. We sit at the intersection of all of these different worlds where people have to perform under pressure, the worlds of sport, business, government, academia. So I had a chance to ask Olympic athletes, I had a chance to ask Navy SEALs, emergency physicians, but honestly, more important than that, I had a chance to ask hundreds of, busy managers, people who are raising kids and caring for aging parents, about the pressure they're under. And that's where a lot of the interesting insights came from, that hopefully we're gonna kind of get into today. But it really did start with this question right here, which is, what's the most pressure you've ever been under? That's really at the heart of the book.
Yeah, and I think, you look at the 2 years, we're coming up on 2 years since we launched into this global pandemic. And I think pressure has been the name of the game for leaders, for managers, anyone really in the business world. And I know you're going to talk about two kinds of pressure later, but I'm curious, so for those who haven't read the book, what were some of the answers you got to the question? Like, what were some of the most interesting ones? Because it's a great question.
Yeah, I heard just a vast array of responses to this question. And oh God, yeah. So I think the place I'll start, because this is a story that seems to really stick with people, and it really stuck with me as one of those examples of, oh yeah, that's pressure. And this is a story from a woman who's manager at a government agency here in Ontario. And she kind of flashed back to this period in her career where she was responsible for orchestrating, and you'll relate to this with your background in communications, she was responsible for orchestrating a highly choreographed day where the agency was going to be rolling out a restructuring. They were announcing layoffs, they were announcing reorganization, and this had kind of been bubbling for a while. They had merged two agencies, and people kind of knew that something was coming down the pike. And then finally the day arrived, after months of planning of how they were going to coordinate the communication and roll out of this thing. And her day started, her morning was spent having 4 one-on-one conversations with people who were exiting the organization, who were being asked to leave. So pretty tough morning. And then she sprinted across town to a conference center where they were about to kick off 6 simultaneous regional meetings where they were going to announce the plans. And so she parked herself in the room with the biggest region. And about 50% of the people were in the room, 50% were joining remotely by Zoom. And at 1 minute to 1 o'clock, when they were going to kick off the meeting, the AV failed completely. Totally. Nobody could hear, nobody could see, nobody could join remotely. So she said the regional president looked right at her because she's the planner. She looks around for an AV team. There's no tech team in the room. So she takes off out of the room, runs down the hallway, decides to take a shortcut through a stairwell. And as she goes into the stairwell, the door closes behind her and she hears a click. Oh. And so she runs over to the door, grabs it, and she's frantic. It turns, door's locked. She looks down at her phone. No cell service, right? She is locked inside of a concrete stairwell with no cell service and 600 people on the other side who are waiting to hear if they still have jobs or not, right? If this is, something that's going to be different. And so for me, like, that's pressure, right? That is significant pressure. And if you're willing, Bart, I thought actually one thing I could do potentially just to make this a little interactive, given that it is a live podcast, Do you okay if we survey some folks on the line here around the most pressure?
Let's do it. I love it.
Okay.
We can't do that with the normal pod.
Let's go for it. Why not, right? You can't do audience engagement when it's pre-recorded.
Right.
So I thought I would ask the folks that are joining here today this question, just because it's always interesting in a group of any size, what kind of responses you get. And so for the folks that are listening in here that have joined and can hopefully see the screen, what is the most pressure you've ever been under? And what would you say if you had to distill it down into one sentence?
And Dane, I know you have at the top there Menti. Is this something that people can go to and punch their code in?
Exactly, yeah. So if you look at the top of the slide there and you head to menti.com, any internet device will do. Grab a phone, a tablet, pop open a browser tab, and then you're going to put in that 8-digit code that's showing at the top of the screen, 86721573. And then just on reflection, what's the one sentence, and this is of course completely anonymous, but we're not collecting any data whatsoever. What is the most pressure that you've ever been under? And I kind of pre-populated it here with a little one sentence on Jen, locked in a stairwell with failing AV. But I'll give everybody just a few seconds to collect their thoughts, find their way to the poll, and hopefully share for you, what is the most pressure you've ever been under? Okay, so it looks like people have found their way to the poll, which is great. I'll just give everybody a few minutes to, or a few seconds to type and hit submit.
Already better than doing the podcast by audio without people. It's making it a cool experience.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to engage for sure. All right, even with just the first few responses in, while others let their thumbs catch up with their brains, let's take a look at what we've got going on here. So, delivering multiple layoffs at the same time. So, a part of Jen's story, the pressure of having to deliver really difficult news. And, as somebody who's had to deliver that message a few times myself, absolutely, right? You get that incredible feeling of discomfort physiologically. That's the kind of thing that the night before keeps you up, makes it hard to sleep because you've got this conversation coming up the next day or multiple conversations. Wife about to deliver a baby and they lose the heartbeat and rush her into the operating room. So here we're dealing with like existential pressure, the pressure of life and death, and the decisions that I make, my ability to get there quickly, to make sure, those things really have significant stakes attached to them. Not having a job during the pandemic. Right. So the pandemic, we'll get into this, but it has been a real microcosm of all of the things that create significant pressure, the hugely important things like financial security and health and safety of our loved ones. Stuck in an elevator between floors on my way to give a talk to 300 people. This is one that I can relate to very personally, and just the unbelievable feeling that starts to rise and rise and rise and rise as you go from, oh, I'm sure this thing will start moving, to like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Right? There's 300 people waiting on the other side of this thing. In charge of an army platoon in wartime. One of the stories I heard for the book was Kurt Cronin, a Navy SEAL team commander, talking about the pressure of leading others into potentially dangerous situations. Running behind on bills and being around the family with expectations. So again, just hugely important, highly uncertain stuff. Managing 2 jobs, helping 4 family members immigrate to Canada and start from scratch. I want everybody to just take a peek at what's on screen here, and thank you to those who made the decision to share something reasonably personal here. One of the things that has been the most profound learnings from this project, because I've now asked thousands of people these questions, or this question in particular, is that I can honestly say now, whenever I walk into a room, whether it's a virtual room or a physical room, I have a deeper appreciation for the experiences that any collective of people brings to their work, to their life, to a session like this one. It never fails to amaze me, whether the group is 10 people or 1,000 people, the depth of experience that we all have in navigating really high pressure situations. This is that old line, other people are always dealing with stuff that you don't know anything about. Everybody's fighting a battle you know nothing about. I think the same is true with pressure. The amount of collective experience around pressure in any group is remarkable. The other thing you see reflected on here that it is very typical of surveying a group on this question is just how broad the range of experiences are. Right? We have everything in here from, classic sort of microcosm things like I got to deliver a big speech and I'm getting delayed, all the way to the life and death stuff of, a child without a heartbeat or commanding an army platoon. There's stuff that is, the gamut from little moments of pressure to periods of pressure. So yeah, I think pressure really does span, the vast range of human experiences. And what I really took as my task for the book was to say, okay, as different as all of these things are, what do they share? What do they have in common? Because there are patterns in pressure, right? There are patterns in the stuff that creates it. There are patterns in some of the problems it can cause. And I think most helpfully, there's patterns in what we can do about it, how we can use it really productively. So I thought this could be an interesting grounding just to see what everybody's bringing in. But that's, those patterns are certainly where my interest went.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, I think, when you talk, a couple things that stand out to me, one, as you said, is this breadth of experiences that create pressure. And secondly, the difference of types of pressure, you describe, I mean, you have terminology around it, whether it's existential or kind of sustained. And I think, the last thing that resonated with me from reading your book is just the fact that, like, we are all going to deal with pressure for life.
Right.
But there are better ways to deal with that. Often when people come to the Humphrey Group and say, hey, I'd like to not face pressure when I go to give a public address, or I wish I could get away from the stress. And I say, that never happens. But
Never.
How you mentally approach it, how you prepare for it, can help you embrace it and manage it. And I think what you've really done in the book with actually creating an equation around pressure, to me, is the beginning of that understanding and almost demystification of pressure. So maybe you could talk a bit about like what you learned in your research and how you came up with what I thought was a very compelling equation for pressure.
Well, yeah, and Bart, I want to just really reinforce what you said there, which is pressure is our constant companion. And I do think sometimes people feel like pressure is this like nasty byproduct of life that I just got to like minimize and kind of deal with and bubble wrap and try to, store over there somewhere. And my belief on this is that pressure is not just like this inevitable nasty thing we have to deal with. It's an essential input into performance. You don't get high pressure without performance. Pressure is inherent in the human journey of growth and development. If I'm going to do stuff I haven't done before, I'm going to experience pressure. And at the same time, pressure is a double-edged sword. You're absolutely right? It is uncomfortable. It can lead to burnout. It can lead to mental injury. It can lead to stress leave. And, so there are absolutely downsides to pressure. And at the same time, when I talk to people about their highest pressure moments, inevitably what I also hear is that, it was actually the energy under that pressure that gave me the strength that I needed to handle that situation. Like, pressure is a source of energy. When you look at like, where do more world records get set in sport than anywhere else? They get set at the Olympics. Why? Because there's pressure, right? It's the pressure that is that source of energy that can help propel us forward. So pressure very much is a double-edged sword, to your point. And I think, Carl Jung said decades ago, what we resist persists. And I think when people try to push the pressure away, it just gets magnified with a sense of helplessness. It's that ability to open yourself up to go, okay, here it is. What am I going to do with that energy? And I think the ability to use it productively comes back to where you finished your question, which is the equation. Like, if we're going to manage pressure productively, we got to understand what creates it in the first place. And so that was what I kind of went in search of, was when we look at all of these experiences, what do they have in common? What are the things that create these high pressure moments? And it turns out, it's actually deceptively simple. Like, pressure is not as complicated as it appears at first. That you really only need two things for people to experience pressure in an environment. And I'll use a little bit of a visual aid here just to build the equation. But the first thing that you need is importance. Right? So, how important the outcome of a situation is to us is directly proportional to the amount of pressure that we feel. We don't feel pressure if stuff doesn't matter to us, if we don't care about the outcome. But just because something is important to us doesn't necessarily mean we're going to feel pressure. There has to be a second thing in the air, and that's uncertainty. Right? So this is where human beings experience pressure. We experience at the intersection of, hey, this really matters to me,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know how it's going to go, right? I don't know how it's going to turn out. And I think
So is
what's
it and
important.
sorry
Oh,
to
sorry.
jump in there, Dane. When you
Yeah.
say uncertainty, are you talking about uncertainty of the outcome? Are you talking about uncertainty of how you'll perform, or just describe a bit more that what you mean by that term?
Yeah, it all ladders back from the uncertainty of the outcome. And of course, what ratchets up the uncertainty around the outcome is the uncertainty around your performance. I mean, the outcome in most situations is almost always uncertain, right? But our performance, our confidence in our preparation is a huge way that we can, reduce uncertainty to some extent. But it really is the outcome. And that goes back to importance as well, by the way. I had a really astute question a couple of months back where somebody said, well, how come I feel pressure when I'm doing work that I don't even think is important? And it's like, okay, well, the task may seem unimportant to you, but probably having a job is important to you, and not getting fired is important. So it's actually the outcome that is at stake that really is what kind of correlates to pressure, not necessarily the importance of the task. And I think that the multiplication sign in here is very deliberate, right? Sometimes we kind of played around with how to write this equation, and the multiplication sign basically represents the fact that the more important a situation is, the less uncertainty it requires to create pressure. So if I'm doing something that's relatively unimportant, like just use a simple example, let's say I buy a $5 lottery ticket. The 99.99% uncertainty, it doesn't really create that much pressure.
Right.
But if I'm getting, wheeled down the hospital corridor to a life-saving operation with a 90% success rate,
Right.
the 10% uncertainty, that is going to create a fair bit of pressure for me. So it really is this sort of combination of importance and uncertainty.
Okay.
I think what's a little bit unique, in the modern world, because you could argue, hey, human beings have had to deal with important, uncertain situations since the dawn of time. In fact, go back to the start of the 20th century, 2 world wars, hugely important, highly uncertain, in many ways, importance and uncertainty have been just constants. I think the thing that's a little bit unique that I heard over and over again from people I talked to about the modern world is just volume, right? Just the sheer amount of tasks, of decisions, of distractions that really surround our important, uncertain moments. And so that's really it. Those are the 3 things. There's importance, there's uncertainty, and volume. And if you diagnose kind of when you're feeling really, pressurized, it typically comes down to some combination of those 3 things as we think about it.
So let's delve into those a bit. Just throw some questions out there. First on the macro equation or macro look at this equation, are they all like equivalent? In other words, if you really thought of them as math, right? Is it really, apple, apple, apple? Like, is it 3 times 3 times 3? Or are they weighted differently in your research?
I think it's a great question. I think each high pressure situation presents itself with a different weighting of these 3 things. So it's like over the course of a life, are they equally weighted? I think yes. But I think it is very asymmetrical depending on the situation you find yourselves in. And so in particular, I see a really big distinction between what I call in the book peak pressure moments versus the grind or the long haul. Both are pressure, right? But peak pressure moments really are dominated over here, right? They really are about like this hugely important, highly uncertain thing, and they collide in a speech or an Olympic performance or an entrance exam or a job interview, right? It's like this violent collision of this really matters to me and I don't know how it's going to go, but then it's over, right? And maybe it goes really well and we feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. Maybe it goes really poorly and we feel a sense of regret or dissatisfaction, but we don't feel pressure anymore, right? The pressure's gone. Versus, when we think about the grind or the long haul, it tends to be dominated a little more over here, where it's more like just what's the load that I'm carrying over a longer period of time. And it is, shot through with importance and uncertainty. It's important I keep my job and it's important that, my kids get to school and I make my mortgage payments, but it's not this like acute binary sense of importance. That's more the background hum, but it's the volume that's kind of dominating a little bit.
That's very helpful, and I think I'd like to delve into that sustain versus peak. I mean, I put in the into your Q&A, it was me whose wife was, wheeled into the OR. And that was the ultimate sustained pressure moment for us, waiting to
Yep.
have a delivery, and then suddenly the shock. And then as soon as it happened, then it was over and they refound the heartbeat. So it was, but that moment, it was the least volume possible, but the highest intensity for me and for her that I
Absolutely.
experienced. So totally the antithesis of then, your first year as a parent where it's just volume.
Exactly. It's a great example. Yeah. That's the
Yeah.
peak pressure followed by the grind, right? The peak pressure
Yeah.
resolves, and
And
it's like,
I think that's one of the hardest things about when you become a parent. You go through this acute peak pressure moment, and then you normally would recover, and then they're like, "Great, here's your child. Stop sleeping for the next year or so." So,
it's funny, Bart, though, that you raise that, because I think that to me is a great, the birth of a child, in particular the first child, is to me a great example of the power of pressure, which is, it's like, so what is it that allows us as parents, as human beings, to sustain for 6 months on no sleep, with abject terror that we are screwing everything up, following, it's the energy under pressure. It's like we feel this sense of like, I got to do something here. This is important. And if I don't, do this correctly, it's a little bit uncertain.
yeah.
So I think that is a really good example of how kind of things come together a bit.
So let's talk about each of the components and how you should think about them if you want to better manage pressure. Because I'm imagining that your mental framing around these is helpful. So let's take, we've talked about volume in the moment, but let's go back to importance. Should you reduce your pressure by like trying to think that something is less important? Like, what advice cognitively do you give to people to try and lessen that pressure on the importance front?
Yeah. So this is where stuff starts to get fun, because I think the story here is delightfully complicated and delightfully almost symmetrical. So I talked up front about how pressure itself is kind of this double-edged sword. It can be a real source of energy, it can be energizing, and it can be overwhelming. And the same is actually true for every component part of pressure: importance, uncertainty, and volume. And so importance is a great way to start to unpack this sort of paradox that, we need things to be important, and importance can be overwhelming. And so I think that, the way this kind of plays out in reality comes back to this notion of the difference between peak pressure moments and the grind. Right. So when we are going through long haul pressure, right, when we have the days, the weeks, the months, the years, in those kind of prolonged periods, and this is a great example, you're giving birth to a child example is a great example of this, right? Through that first year, we have to really consciously work to pull importance close, to clear a line of sight from what we're doing on a day-to-day basis up to, why does this really matter to me, right? What's really important about what I'm doing here? And, with the birth of a child, that's a relatively easy exercise. It's pretty easy to clear a line of sight. Sometimes at work, it's a little bit trickier. That's why we have, exercises around purpose and connecting with your why. It's why Simon Sinek had to write a great book. There's a discipline to being able to connect what I am doing up to why this really matters. And in my experience, when I talk to people, because one of the things that I started diving into in that area was, okay, well, what is the path that you took to importance? If you were able to find a line of sight from your daily, decisions and tasks up to importance, what route did you take? And in general, there are really only three. Like, meaning can seem like this big, amorphous, vague idea of connecting with meaning. In my opinion, there's really only three paths to meaning. There is growth, which is you get a good answer to the question, how is this pressure helping me grow? That can give meaning to pressure. If I feel like it's strengthening me, it's moving me forward in a way that matters. The second path is contribution, which is I get to a good answer to the question, how is enduring this pressure benefiting others? That is certainly the path that we take with our children. It's the path that many people in healthcare have had to take over the past 2 years as they tolerate, unbelievable levels of pressure. And then the third path is connection, which is getting to a good answer to, how is this pressure bringing me closer to the people that I care about? Which for many, regular people through the pandemic, that's the one that I heard the most of during the pandemic, was like, this is really heavy, but, it brought me closer to my kids. I spent more time with my family. I wasn't on the road as much. Like I actually got a chance to really connect.
And
But
so
I think
what I'm
over the
hearing,
long haul, you got to answer one of those three questions, right? You don't
and
have
what
to
I'm
answer
hearing
all
from
of them.
you, yeah, that's really helpful. What I'm hearing from you on the importance front is not that connecting to your importance and choosing one of those three paths is the way to do it. It's not going to reduce the pressure, but it will make it allow you to perform through it and to avoid burnout and in fact find energy. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's the story for the long haul, right? Is pull it close, take one of those three paths, get a sense of connect. But here's the thing, Bart, this is what makes it so interesting, is when you get thrown into a peak pressure moment, you have to do the exact opposite, which is you actually have to be able to disconnect a little bit from importance, not to convince yourself that it's unimportant, but to see it in perspective, right? You actually have to orient your attention in the complete other side of the direction and ask yourself, okay, what's not at stake here? Because when we're heading into a job interview or a
Right.
sales presentation or a big speech, it's not like importance is elusive, like it's crushing us in those moments, right? It's all we can think about
We
is how
know it's
important
important.
this is. Yeah.
Right.
And so, I think both of these, this is kind of the duality of importance is I have to see what I do as important, in particular over the long haul, without being overwhelmed by what's at stake.
Right. So
And
for
from a time basis, right? So take a very simple example that I heard a lot in my research, which is, big sales presentation. Again, this is something that is bread and butter for you guys. I got to stand and deliver. I got to, communicate really effectively. There's a lot on the line here from a revenue standpoint. So I actually, in the preparation for that sales meeting or prep, I actually do want to focus on why is this important to me, right? I want to think about the commission check. I want to think about the revenue for the bonus pool. I want to remind myself, hey, maybe this is an input to an early promotion decision. I want to see this as a test of my capability, because that's where I'm going to get the energy to prepare, right? I need the energy to prepare. Now, when I am about to walk into the room to give that presentation, if I carry all of that with me, like, oh my God, my commission's at, the bonus pool's at stake, and it's going to be a disaster. So I got to flip immediately to the fact that there are important things in my life that are going to be there regardless of whether I win or lose this thing, right? I'm still going to have my family, my health, respect to my cause. And that's where I focus my attention, is on what's not at stake during performance. So the focus during preparation is to pull importance close. The focus during performance is to see things in perspective, because that's where the freedom to perform comes from.
Yeah, it's a real flip. So so understanding what kind of pressure am I facing? Is it for peak or is it long haul? And then either connecting, or well, if it's peak, getting away from the importance. If it's long haul, connecting to it. Let's talk uncertainty. Is there a difference of how to think about uncertainty in peak versus long haul?
Yeah. So you asked earlier, is there a part of this equation that kind of dominates? Are they all equal? Or I do think uncertainty is a particularly sort of painful one for people. And I think it's one that's very front and center for all of us right now, just because of the amount of uncertainty that we've been carrying for 2 years. And actually, when it comes to one of my favorite pieces of research, that's not my own research, but some researchers at a University College London did a little experiment that I think really illustrates for me why or how uncertainty is processed by us as human beings. So what they did is they hooked their research subjects up to biofeedback equipment. So this is gear that measures the physiological markers of stress. So things like heart rate, respiration rate, pupil dilation. So they were measuring signs of stress. And then they had them do this little exercise on a computer screen where they would flip over virtual rocks. And if a rock that they flipped over on the screen had a snake underneath it, they would get an electric shock on the back of their hand.
Sounds like Ghostbusters. They're getting electrocuted.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. This is the Milgram experiment. There's a bunch of these electricity-based experiments going on. And, there is a pathway for sadists to get into academia, yes. I think. Anyways, that's maybe a different point. So here was the interesting thing. People very quickly developed some pattern recognition when they were doing this exercise, and they realized that there were certain types of rocks that always had snakes under them, other types of rocks that never had snakes, and then there was this third kind of class of rocks that it was about a 50-50 chance there was going to be a snake under there. And when they looked at the data after the fact, what they discovered is that people got more stressed physiologically when they had a 50% chance of getting an electric shock than when they had a 100% chance of getting an electric shock. And I mean, cognitively, this makes no sense, right? It's like, okay, well, take the door where you got a 50% chance of getting out from the shock. it's the uncertainty that
Mm.
creates the pressure for people, right? It's like they want to know, am I going to get shocked or am I not going to get shocked? It's that, middle ground where we start to experience pressure. And so I do think uncertainty for us as human beings is particularly uncomfortable. And when we can't flee it, we start to experience pressure. And so this does lead quite naturally to, well, if that's the case, our imperative is to eliminate uncertainty. And that is really true in peak pressure moments, right? The critical uncertainty tool in peak pressure moments is direct action, right? Identify what I can control and put my attention on what I can control so that I start to make progress. Because when I make progress, uncertainty starts to abate and I start to get out of the traps that can accompany pressure, right? The poor decision making, the emotional, the amygdala hijack, that kind of stuff. As soon as I reduce the uncertainty, I come back to a more centered place. One of my favorite anecdotes or stories from the book, I guess it's kind of a metaphor more than anything, came from a beach volleyball player I interviewed named Martin Reeder. And he talked about how in the game of beach volleyball, there is so much stuff that is out of your control, right? The opponents are out of your control, the crowd's out of your control, the officiating's out of your control, the weather is out of your control. He said the one time that you have control is when you are standing behind the service line with the ball, right? The serve is the one thing that you have within your control. And he told me the story of getting ready to qualify for the Rio Games in 2016. And he said to qualify, we knew we were going to have to go into Mexico and beat the Mexican team. And he said, we knew this was going to be brutal because they're a really good team. The crowd was going to be really hostile, which sometimes influences the officiating. And he said, so Josh and I, his partner, he said, for 6 months, we practiced this really non-traditional serve. And in game 3 of the Olympic qualifiers, I moved to a totally different side of the service line. I served the ball they had no idea was coming for an ace. And that's what punched our ticket to Rio. And so his advice, he said, whenever I'm in high pressure situations, I ask myself, what's your serve? What is your serve in this situation? And so I do think that ability to get a little distance in peak pressure and go, listen, there's a lot of stuff out of my control here, but what is my serve right now? And that might be as simple as breathing, right? Getting my breathing under control. That could be a routine. We see that in sport all the time. Like, hey, everything's crazy right now, but I can focus on doing this routine that's going to bring me back to center. It could be my perspective that's within my control. And I can, but we got to find a serve when we are going through peak pressure moments. And so that's kind of the peak pressure imperative.
Yeah, it's so helpful. And, just your way of thinking about pressure and these 3 elements of the equation and how to manage them, I think is invaluable. Even though we've been dealing with so much uncertainty for the last 18 months, I think the reality is uncertainty continues to exist. Just for example, are we going to be return to premises? Are we going to be virtual? Yep. What will work look like? So I just want to kind of take it to the next step here, because the questions that people are being asked as leaders at work. I mean, this is a podcast about how to lead through communication. How would you advise people on this webinar and listening to this podcast to think about using the research that you've done to lead and inspire people in their world, could be at work, could be out, in their community, to deal better with pressure?
Well, I think it's interesting. This is something I've thought a lot about, Bart, in particular with communication and decision making, because the flip side to the uncertainty story that so find your serve, what you can control, control that. Because that is such a default mode of action for a lot of leaders and high performers. It's like, okay, I'm in the middle of uncertainty. I find what I can control, I act. This mode of direct action, find hammer, hit nail, becomes a little bit of a default mode that we try to apply over the long haul, over the grind. And the problem is when we try to apply that over the grind, it actually reinforces pressure because there is uncertainty that we cannot tame. If we try to control everything over the long haul, it just builds a sense of helplessness and actually, creates more pressure. And so the corollary to kind of taking direct action to control uncertainty is over the long haul, we've actually got to get to a place where we can embrace the fact that, listen, the future is out of my control and, things are going to work out the way that they should in the end. And so I think to your question about leaders and what are some of the things that leaders can really be doing, I think there is an important place for leaders when it comes to providing certainty around process as opposed to certainty around outcome.
Okay.
I have seen a lot of leaders, even in the last kind of 2 or 3 months, dig themselves into a hole because they think their job is to provide certainty to people, to tame uncertainty and reduce pressure.
So for example,
it's like, all right,
at the beginning
we're
of the
going to be,
summer, if you had a leader who said, we will be back on premises September 1st.
yeah,
That
exactly.
obviously has not come to pass for many companies, and that would just dig them that hole you're talking about.
And this is happening all over the place, right? We are seeing this in large companies, small companies, private sector, public sector. It's like, we've got our bold plan. This is the, exact dates that things are going to roll out on. And then all of a sudden you hit those dates and it's like, actually, sorry, change of plan, guys. We're going back remote, right. Or, oh, we're going to do 3 days in the office. And then there's this revolt and it's like, actually we hadn't thought, so I think, I do think there is, you have to balance, just like importance, there is this tension of, I got to see what I'm doing as important without, overweighting the importance. I think there is this tension for leaders of, we have to act to create certainty for people, but we also have to communicate that there is uncertainty that we just need to embrace. We need to accept. And I do think, and this is more of, this isn't in the book so much as just kind of my evolving, I had a great conversation with a Harvard and HBS prof named Joe Fuller yesterday about exactly this topic. And his whole thing was, we've got to be clear with people. What we need to be clear with people about is the process that we're going to use and what we are certain and uncertain about. And I think when we try to overdo it and provide false certainty, we get into a trap. At the same time, if we don't provide people with any clarity or certainty, that is debilitating as well. And so it's separating those things, I think, is where we find, really effective leaders doing good work.
I think it's really powerful because we know from the pandemic that employees are looking for authenticity and vulnerability, but they're also looking for leadership. And I think that can seem to be a dichotomy, an unresolvable conflict. But what you're really saying is, when you're in long haul uncertainty, long haul pressure, your job is to provide clarity around the process, but not the outcomes. And that's the best thing you can do to communicate as a leader today. Is that right?
Yeah. Clarity on what is the process. I think in particular, this difference between steady state process, which is like, we're going to do this, then this, then this, then this, versus what I think most of us are in the middle of right now is a process that is more akin to rapid experimentation, right? So here's what we're going to try, here's how we're going to gather feedback, and here's how we're going to make decisions on, whether we keep doing that or we do something else. Right. So when I say clarity around process, that's really what I'm talking about, is as opposed to announcing a plan, you announce a process for continuously improving a plan. And people have clarity on how that's going to work, even if they're not exactly sure on, what the outcomes are going to be from that process.
Dane, I've gotten to enjoy asking you questions, but I think we should open it up to the group here. And there is a question box at the bottom of your Zoom link. You can see Q&A. If you go in there, you can type in your questions. As questions come in, I'll put them to Dane. So this is a great opportunity to put anything in. We'll give it a few seconds here for people to write in, and if no one jumps, I'm always hungry to ask more questions. So
do you want to, just because I know it takes people a little bit, do you want to talk about volume just briefly while people are?
Because I know we talked about how to manage the first two components of the equation. So yeah, talk to me about how you should think about handling that third component of the equation.
Yeah, so I think volume's a little bit unique in that, like, importance and uncertainty are sort of subjective things, like how important I tag something as versus somebody else, how uncertain really is the outcome. Volume is a little bit more of like an objective thing where it's just like, how big is the pile that you are faced with? How many tasks do you have? How many decisions do you. And so I think this is one that, if I were to characterize the pandemic period, it really has been just a huge period of volume for a lot of people in the working world. The pace has accelerated to a degree to which I think is, the word unprecedented gets thrown around a lot. I do think it is unprecedented. Everybody was like, oh, great, we're going to save our commute time. And then the commute time got filled up, with all this additional productivity and work. And so I think when volume is the dominant kind of thing that's creating pressure for people, I think there is this, what feels like a very rational tendency to turn to time management as the solution, right? It's like, hey, I got a lot on my plate that I got to get done. I need to get more efficient in how I do this. And while this makes kind of rational sense, there is a big problem with this, which is, at the end of the day, time management is a trap. It's a blind alley. It's a trap. What happens to people who get really good at time management? do they get more volume or do they get less volume?
Right. So if you get the inbox 0, you just end up as instantly more emails can come in. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Every email is a boomerang, right? It's like if I get really efficient at answering 50 emails, it makes it much more likely I'm going to get 50 emails back, right? And just like most people's calendar is like a battlefield, right? And it's like if you manage to, like, through effective time management, you free up an hour on your calendar, somebody in the organization is like, boom, right? Saw you had a free hour from 1 to 2. Like, if you could join this project, it's like setting off a signal flare.
Right.
One of my favorite cartoons, Dilbert cartoons ever, was this cartoon where Catbert, the consultant, comes in and he's talking to the boss, and he says to the boss, how do you guys reward your high performers around here? And the boss says, oh, we load them up with work until they become average performers. And I think this is the promise of time management in a nutshell, is like, the more efficient I get, the more volume I accumulate. And so I don't want to knock time management listen, there's a role for time management. The thing that I want to differentiate is that time management is a productivity strategy. It's not a pressure strategy. It's a great way to be more productive, but it doesn't reduce pressure. In fact, it actually typically allows us, it allows us to accumulate more, which creates pressure. And so this is where, go ahead.
A lot of the norms around calendars changed, right? Because it used to be, you would assume that you needed time to travel from one meeting to the next, time which you could use to reduce your volume. If I'm thinking in terms of your equation. And now, because of Zoom and everyone's just sitting there, everyone just books meeting after meeting, which thereby inherently increases volume during a time when uncertainty was massively increased as well.
Could not agree. I think that's a brilliant example. And to me, that gets at, when it comes to volume, it is really less about accommodating all of the things that people are asking of you. And it is more about, can we attack the root causes of volume, which are, tasks, decisions, and distractions. And your example, to me, is a perfect example of, I talk about, when it comes to distractions in particular, structure beats willpower every time. And what I mean by that is, it is very hard to will ourselves to a better place from a volume perspective, because we have so many external inputs. We have the people sending us those calendar invites. We have our friends in Silicon Valley who are, highly paid to use the latest neuroscience to distract us from what it is that we're trying to do. When we rely on willpower, like, oh, I'm going to say no to this stuff, I'm going to, tune out all my notifications, it's insane. If we go with structure, which is what you're talking about, it's like, hey, I've got a half an hour commute there. I cannot book a meeting in that half hour. I don't need willpower, right? Structure is enforcing a reduction in volume. And so I think people's ability to actually build those structures in a virtual world, to say, hey, you know what, from 12:30 to 1, not only am I writing do not book on my calendar, but I'm going into airplane mode and I'm turning Wi-Fi off on my laptop, and I'm creating a half hour where I don't need to use any willpower to tune out distractions. I don't need to say no to anything because it's never even going to enter my consciousness.
Right.
I think that ability to use structure and alleviate the burden on willpower, I think, is increasingly important in a virtual world.
Yeah, I mean, even in an analog world, when I wrote my book 6 years ago, I had to go to my in-laws' cottage where there was no cell or internet service for 3-day writing retreats. And it took that to disconnect from the hive mind, if you will, and be successful. But what's the kind of coda to that is now the cell service has encroached, and there's not there's not even an escape there.
This is the problem with airplanes. Like, airplanes for me were the perfect
Wi-Fi.
Now luckily the Wi-Fi there is still expensive enough and crappy enough that my willpower actually is enough to stop myself from buying the in-flight Boingo or whatever. But yeah, I think that's a great example, right? It's like, and you don't need willpower. All you need is, a lack of technology infrastructure, and boom, like, the distraction problem is solved. So yeah, I think that's a really, really good example for sure.
Dane, I know we're reaching the end of our time here. This has been tremendous. I really appreciate you sharing insights into the book. We didn't get any questions. I know you have a way people can connect with you on LinkedIn. You're super responsive. You're on Twitter. Highly recommend the follow. Before we get to a few things I know you're offering everyone who's attending, let's just wrap it up with a question. How does this understanding of pressure change what leaders need to think about if they want to be effective in today's world?
So I think God, that's a tough question. It's a good one. I'm going through what's the one thing that I would recommend? I think so. I'm going to go almost back to the start where I talked about this flip from pressure as this kind of nasty byproduct that we just have to manage to pressure as an essential input to performance. And I think if there's one thing that I could, leave with leaders is I think our job as a leader is not to be the heroic leader that shields everybody that reports into us from all the pressure. We just absorb it like a heat shield and like protect our teams. I think that is, people talk about servant leadership. I think that's sacrificial leadership. Like, I think that's a way of, burning yourself out on the altar of trying to protect your team from pressure. I think, my thing is, as a leader, you need to be a shaper of pressure, right? And so if we go back to the equation, I think there's kind of three roles, right? And I'll just put them up just, for people that are following along. Like, I think we are a shaper of perspective. So we have to help people simultaneously connect with how what we're doing as a team is important, like it matters, and free them up to have a little bit of a sense of play, right? Listen, what we do really matters. And at the end of the day, we need to have some fun with it, right? We go home, we've got families, there's stuff outside of work. This isn't the be all and end all of reality, right? So it's helping people hold that tension. That's the shaper of perspective role. I think here, this is our ability to shape a sense of control and self-efficacy, right? To get our team really oriented around what is our serve, what is the thing that we can control that makes the biggest difference, and put them in a place where they accept the uncertainty of the rally, right? We're going to get knocked off balance. We're going to get buffeted around a little bit, and there's always going to be a serve, right? We're always going to figure out from this new position, where can we exert some control? And then I think the third that we just talked about is to be a shaper of volume, right? Yes, we need to create the physical conditions for people to handle volume. That is, nutrition, encouraging exercise, sleep, all that kind of good stuff. And we need to be partners with our people in eliminating volume that's unproductive, right? Auditing the tasks that people are being asked to carry, auditing the decisions that we're making. Do we need to be making all these decisions, or can we just have a rule, so that we don't have to continuously make these calls? So I think, in all three regards, we're not standing and trying to block pressure. We're going, hey, there's energy under here, but we got to make sure that we are holding these three things in tension in a productive place.
I love it. I love it. Great advice. And for those who haven't read the book yet, I know you have something for people. So what can people do to start delving more deeply into how to thrive and embrace pressure?
Yeah, so there's a QR code on screen with a link underneath if the QR is not working for you. This is an opportunity for people to immediately get the first chapter of the book. If you are interested in what we talked about today, it kicks off with a bang right from chapter 1, so you'll get that right away. The other thing that you'll get if you head to that link is I've kind of built a series of sort of three little nudges. So one on importance, one on uncertainty, one on volume, that arrive kind of every 2 weeks, and they're just packed with resources, articles, ideas on how to manage importance, uncertainty, and volume. So if as a leader you want to take on that mantle of a shaper of pressure, there's a wealth of resources in there that can kind of help you on that journey. And then finally, as you mentioned, Bart, if you have a question or want to dialogue around this stuff, this is the best place to find me, to find us. I'm on LinkedIn, Dane Jensen, on Twitter @Dane Jensen, and of course, you can find out all about me and us at thirdfactor.com.
Great. Well, Dane, really appreciate the conversation, the return appearance on the pod. I encourage everyone to read the book. And if you enjoyed the pod, if you haven't been subscribing already, please do. It's on Apple, SoundCloud. We're now on Spotify and a few other platforms. Rate, give it a review. There's a lot of great guests back in the history too, if you want to check it out. And if you want to experience what Dane does, really proud as a partner of Niagara Institute, we've got a program on the site that is kind of newly designed, incorporates some of this research, and encourage you to check it out and register your interest there. So want to thank everyone for coming today. This was a lot of fun. We'll publish this to the feed next week for those who couldn't attend in person. And may you all thrive under pressure. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, everyone. Take care.
You too. Thanks, Bart.